Well, thank you everyone for coming and welcome to the Urban Research Seminar. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Daniel Cohen. Dr. Daniel Cohen is an Assistant Professor of Sociology and the Director of the Sociospatial Climate Collaborative at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Cohen received his bachelor's degree from McGill University in Intellectual History and International Development Studies, and his PhD from our lovely New York University in Sociology. He is the co-author of A Planet to Win: Why We Need a Green New Deal. His scholarship is focused on climate change politics, including the intersections of housing, social movements, and inequalities of race and class, particularly in the United States and Brazil. And while working with collaborators, community organizers, and elected officials, Dr. Cohen has also contributed his expertise to research and policy development for the Green New Deal, and more specifically, the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act. So I know a lot of us are really looking forward to this talk today, since these issues are very pressing and only becoming increasingly more pressing, so I won't take up any more of the time. So thank you to our speaker, Dr. Cohen, for taking the time to meet with us today and sharing your work with us. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Fiona and Jean-Paulo, for this generous introduction. Great, okay. So I'm going to talk today about housing and climate politics. I'm going to take you through a fair bit of my research, especially in São Paulo, and we'll have a short bit kind of near the end getting into a bit more of the kind of Green New Deal piece and some future work. Hopefully, the way this is set up will sort of help us work through like a method for thinking about the way that urban climate politics operate, what urban climate politics really consist of. And if we want to get into more of the contemporary policy struggles around the Green New Deal, then the Q&A could be a perfect time for that. So I've made the argument that nothing will shape urban life in this century more than carbon, efforts to abolish it, and the consequences of its pollution. Probably in this context, it's not even really necessary to say any more about that. Today, I'm going to focus in particular on efforts to abolish carbon, to decarbonize urban life. And there's a bit of a puzzle there, which is that there's a huge amount of consensus at this point from all kinds of experts, from Marxist urbanists like Mike Davis to literally Shell Oil, putting out reports saying that the densification of cities can slash carbon emissions, improve quality of life, potentially dynamize urban economies. And so there's this idea that like a certain kind of density policies can bring down emissions and be essentially like a win-win socially, ecologically, economically. And yet, that agenda in cities in the world has mostly stagnated. We've had some successes, not a ton of them, and we need to better understand why this widespread consensus has not led to the kind of urban climate leadership that has been promised over the last 2 decades. So today I want to give some answers to the questions of why have cities' low carbon efforts stagnated so much? When there has been success, what's that look like? And we want to pace, since this pivots around carbon and it's actually not so obvious how to think about the relationship between carbon and urban life, we want to think a little bit about carbon accounting as well. And I'm going to be building in particular my research in New York and São Paulo, which are 2 cases of low carbon policy ambition, but also pretty troubled implementation. They're cities with lightly regulated land markets, which is pretty key to this argument. Nothing I'm saying I think really applies, let's say, to a place like China. But they are cities, one in the global north, one in the global south. So if we can find commonalities, I think that's pretty meaningful. My work departs pretty significantly from the main body of work that takes up the question of low carbon urban governance, which comes out of mainly basically British geography. And my quibble with this literature is not so much in the answers as even more foundationally in their methodology. The way that most research on urban climate governance happens is that scholars drop in on cities, they talk to the green policy elites, and essentially ask them, what have they managed to achieve and why? And they conceptualize urban climate politics as essentially being the success or failure of green policy elites in getting their very good ideas implemented on the ground. Everything outside of that, and in particular, like ordinary people, working class people, people of color and communities, are often conceptualized as these kind of like outsiders, the stick social outside, people who just simply need to be convinced to come on board with the green policy elites' excellent ideas with their strong focus on equity. And this literature has had almost nothing to say in the last 20 years about the most important thing that's happened in cities, which is a gigantic battle over things like housing and democracy and economic inequality. You know, we could talk about Occupy Wall Street, the movements of the squares in the Middle East and elsewhere, and so on. So there's not really much leverage actually in this literature for explaining urban climate politics in their full context of urban conflict. And then when we turn to sociology, we have a very exciting and thriving subfield of environmental sociology, and in particular climate sociology, but it's had almost nothing to say on decarbonizing cities. The major book synthesizing the work of the environmental sociology subsection of the ASA, Climate Change in Society, doesn't have a chapter on cities, doesn't have a sub-chapter on cities. There is good sociological work on environment and urban spaces. It's largely focused on the unequal impacts of pollution, of climate damage. Thinks about things like migration pressures from sea level rise, even things like financial risk regimes, you know, who's gonna have to pay what in terms of like flood insurance, but not really very, very little on the question of decarbonizing cities. How has that succeeded? How has that failed? And I think what all these approaches have in common is a somewhat conventional move in social science, which is that they think about the fields that they are studying by following the climate governance discourse and by mostly talking to climate and energy policy elites. And that is a very small portion of the population. And that leads to work on climate change, and especially work on decarbonizing, where you don't really get much representation from actors who are not, you know, talking constantly about climate change. And yet, if you want to understand the transformation of cities or of the social world more broadly, I think you need to talk to more people. So my argument is that we need to follow the carbon into the viscera of social life. And hopefully this presentation will indicate what that vague and abstract phrase means. But one immediate implication of that is this: just as we've learned and emphasized in social science and in history and in the humanities in the last 40 years that everybody is a cultural actor, everybody is an economic actor, everybody is a political actor at some level, so too everyone is a climate actor. We all take actions that have implications for the climate. And when we think about collective actors, you know, like social movements, those movements are all doing things that have major climate implications, whether or not they're talking about climate, right? We have the whole field of cultural studies because we don't only ask publishers, you know, what the culture of text is, right? And in climate change, we need to do the same. We need to understand that people who don't talk about climate are also climate protagonists and investigate how and why. So let me say a little bit conceptually about how I'm kind of trying to map climates in cities, you know, along these lines. I'm not sure if this was in stuff that you read. I'm going to come over this very quickly, but broadly, it can be helpful to think about urban ecological politics in terms of a couple different categories. One is what I call green ecologies. That's like politics around things that look and feel like nature, clean air, clean water, parks. But there's also something we think of as like gray urban ecologies, which would be urban amenities that are ecological when they save energy, when they help to decarbonize, but they might not look or feel anything like nature. So we could think about big, tall, energy efficient buildings, or, you know, express bus lanes, things you don't look at and necessarily think, oh, that's nature, oh, that's green, but actually it has a very powerful indirect environmental impact. And the whole idea of densifying cities comes from that idea. That being said, there are very different ways to achieve these ecological virtues. And I'd argue the even more powerful distinction is between a kind of luxury ecology mode, which is about saying, and I think we'll say in a bit later on, you know, why Bloomberg regime, you know, exemplifies this in New York. There's a way of saying, well, we have to target the immediate policies for ecological benefit to the professional class, to creative workers, quote unquote, and eventually that will spread to everyone else. And the alternative is a kind of democratic ecology framework, which would be policies that try to reduce inequality and carbon emissions at the same time. Now, one could map any number of urban interventions onto this kind of heuristic grid. Obviously, it's going to depend on the particular city, where bike lanes are located, who they're serving, et cetera. But pretty consistently, I would argue that if you want to think about low carbon urban spaces and you look at carbon footprint accounting, you will find almost always that affordable housing that's located near jobs and services is a very, very low carbon form of urban development. And yet you will hear very, very little in discussions of urban climate politics of the idea that affordable housing complexes and people fighting for affordable housing, you'll hear very little about them as key drivers of low carbon urbanism, right? Even though, again, from a kind of objective point of view, if you follow the carbon, you will find, oh, wait a minute, affordable housing located near jobs and services over and over anchors low carbon urban spaces when you look at carbon accounting. And so that's true substantively, and like I was getting at, it's true politically. So I almost want to reframe the questions I posed earlier. Why has climate, why have urban climate policies succeeded or failed in terms of political coalitions? What are the conditions under which these housing-oriented movements fighting for this form of low-carbon urbanism, under what conditions do they cooperate with green policy elites around like gray ecology politics? Under what conditions are these groups estranged? And what are the consequences for climate politics? So I'm going to draw again on substantial research in New York and Sao Paulo. And the most important part of the slide, beside the fact that I've been doing this for what feels like forever, is that I talk explicitly to groups, to different kinds of groups within the urban scenario. Green policy elites, environmentalists, one group, city planners of all kinds, including politicians, and then third, housing-oriented movements and other social justice movements in cities, even when they often don't talk about climate. Okay, so let's jump to Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo is the biggest city in Brazil. It's arguably the economic capital of South America, 22 million inhabitants in the metro region, 12 million in the city. It's a notoriously and violently unequal city, extremes of wealth and poverty. It's also, despite having a dense built up downtown, a very sprawling city. It's a city that in 2009 passed an extremely ambitious climate law under a center-right government that put Sao Paulo on the map as kind of one of the leading global South cities to put out policy to try to tackle climate change. Let's now get some context. What is the context in which this climate policy lands? It's a context where the downtown of Sao Paulo in the early to mid 2000s has become kind of a battleground of urban politics. It's a region that suffered significant disinvestment over the previous decades, very similar to what you see in many American cities. At the same time, this downtown region is where there is a huge number of jobs, actually. One of the two cores of jobs in Sao Paulo. And you've had a lot of working class people, in addition to middle class people, pushed out to far reaches of the city. So you have a huge amount of commuting from outside of the city into the city center. It causes a huge amount of traffic. Sao Paulo, by one study, had the second worst traffic and commuting times of any major city in the world. This is a major preoccupation for urban planners. Huge working class people often commute 4 hours a day to get in and out of the center. And so there's this idea that something has to be done. There has to be more jobs downtown. Sorry, there are a lot of jobs downtown. There needs to be more housing downtown, more development, some kind of change to the urban model. Now, one of the major actors in downtown Sao Paulo is housing movements. At the time, the vacancy rate, the residential vacancy rate of the area, there's a woman called Ivete Araújo in the ethanol industry. Some call that a green job, slavery-like conditions. Araújo and her partner and 2 children ultimately moved into Sao Paulo looking for a better economic life. Very typical story in the early 2000s. She moved into an affluent person's apartment. She became a domestic worker there. And the room that she lived in was so polluted with mold that she was suffering serious health consequences. So she asked the landlord and her employer for a small raise so she could rent a room elsewhere in the city. And he said, "You can pack up your bags and leave." She ended up on the streets for weeks with her family and ultimately came into contact with the housing movement downtown that kind of invited her to join in this new project of occupying abandoned and vacant buildings that real estate speculators were sitting on to put pressure on the city government to convert those into social housing. And ultimately, Ivete Araújo became a powerful leader in the housing movement and led the occupation of the building here that's pictured, And that building became kind of the nerve center, political nerve center for a whole project in downtown Sao Paulo of housing movements and their allies in the Workers' Party among left-wing intellectuals to kind of rethink the development of the downtown along lines of working class housing, social housing, cultural amenities, and a kind of democratic revitalization of the urban center. So you have really substantial participation of the housing movement. You have other nearby occupations that have, for instance, big, very well-stocked libraries inside of these squatted buildings, and that refer to, or a big part of the Black liberation movement in Sao Paulo as well. So, the banner hanging from this prominent occupation, Zumbi Somos Nós, is a reference to the Black liberation struggle in Brazil. But this movement for a kind of working class revitalization of the downtown becomes threatened by climate change. But it doesn't become threatened by climate change in the form of extreme weather. It becomes threatened by climate change in the form of low carbon policy that is linked to a real estate agenda that's not being developed for working class people. What happens in the mid 2000s is you get a carbon emissions footprint for the city that's published in 2005 that finds that 3/4 of Sao Paulo's carbon emissions come from cars. And this leads environmental elites like Alejandra De Vecchi, who's a brilliant woman working in Sao Paulo's environmental secretariat at the time, to say, listen, if all of our carbon emissions are coming from cars, this travel in and out of the city center, then what we need to do is have a much more dense, compact city. We need to have housing near jobs. And we can start by having an example project in downtown Sao Paulo. We'll build up a bunch of new housing. We'll bring in some new, more high class industries, and we'll make this really attractive kind of like almost bubble of green redevelopment. And then we'll use that to sell the rest of the city on this kind of densification and walkability. So De Vecchi manages to convince, here she is again in the center, her boss, the guy pictured in color with a little goatee, Eduardo Jorge, a very high profile environmental secretary in the center-right government, that the environmental agenda and the densification agenda should become one. They hire this person who's holding this strange thing on De Vecchi's right here. His name is Jamie Lerner. He's the most well-known environmental urban designer in all of South America. They hire him to create this plan for downtown redevelopment. This plan is called Nova Luz, a new light. The neighborhood was called Luz. They make a new light. And it was, again, envisioned to basically turn downtown Sao Paulo into a kind of walkable paradise, similar to somewhere like Buenos Aires, sorry, not Buenos Aires, like Barcelona or like Paris. And this is a movement that the housing movement hates because it has no room for them. They have no confidence that they're going to have anywhere to live in this redevelopment, because after all, the very space that they want to redevelop, the green policy elites and the real estate industry, is where the housing occupations are happening. The star here is the place in the neighborhood that will be redeveloped. That is where Araujo's occupation is, for example. So you end up with violent clashes throughout the late 2000s over the fate of the center city redevelopment. The housing movements are violently opposed to the redevelopment, and they have allies among small businesses. Housing movements are violently opposed to this green redevelopment, and the green policy elites are very excited about it and are getting very, very angry with the housing movement. The green policy elites, in fact, managed to get the principle of the compact city, with Nova Luz as its key example, into this ambitious 2009 climate law. They host international meetings in the office of in the same building where the mayor's office is, to debate this densification of downtown Sao Paulo. Eventually, the city hires AECOM, a global infrastructure firm, to come in and take over the entire redevelopment. And who does AECOM hire to lead the project in Sao Paulo? Alejandra De Vecchi, right out of the environmental secretariat. So this is a complete fusion of the real estate agenda and the environmental agenda in Sao Paulo. And then in 2011, Sao Paulo hosts the global C40, big urban climate policy network. They get Michael Bloomberg to come. The center-right mayor Gilberto Kassab, who's in power until 2012, and Bloomberg plant 40 different species of tree during a course of Bloomberg's 2-day visit, really symbolizing the kind of climate politics that are going around in elite spaces, up to this ridiculous photo of Bloomberg watering a tree here in Sao Paulo. And so to be very explicit, what is the social logic of Sao Paulo's green redevelopment plans? It is, in its own mind, a very progressive idea. Here's one of the key green policy elites in Sao Paulo, influential climate activist, at a kind of business summit in the headquarters of Dow Latin America in Sao Paulo, which I attended. He got me in without having to pay the enormous price. And he's up on stage and someone asks him, what kind of help would you need from the private sector that would allow you to move further and faster in all your goals? And he actually says, well, I would like to see each time cities more oriented to people. He's referring to a Danish urban planner called Jan Gehl. He says, I want cities planned for people. For example, he says, in Sao Paulo's case, the key to Sao Paulo's success is to attract and maintain talented young people. Sao Paulo will only compete with cities like San Francisco, Paris, LA, if it succeeds in creating jobs for them, the creative economy. To maintain these intelligent people here, we need a space and urban environment of quality, good sidewalks, sufficient public transportation, etc. And what you sort of realize is that what's going on in Sao Paulo is that in its own way, it is partaking in this global luxury ecology project, which is saying that through green redevelopment, targeting the professional class and the creative class, we will create a new urban model. And then that will have a kind of trickle out climate policy effect that eventually everybody else is gonna get onto it. But at the beginning, the example of the people, cities planned for people, for example, young creatives, young professionals, talented, intelligent people. That's a very particular subsegment of the urban population. And indeed, this reflects in many ways the big low carbon policy idea that's circulating around the world, which is that when the low carbon density is going to have these social and environmental and economic co-benefits, who are they for? Well, very, very often they're for the professional middle class, for creative workers, what Richard Florida calls the creative class. And what remarkably, none of these people seems to notice in most cases is that it's not only green policy elites who want to make changes to housing and land use and transit and buildings to achieve these goals, but you have urban social movements blowing up all over during this moment of enormous financial crisis, housing crisis in cities. And these urban social movements are also demanding in Sao Paulo and elsewhere, changes to land use, housing, transit, and buildings that would also actually get people who work closer to their jobs and closer to their services. But these movements are not talking about carbon. If you go to Occupy Wall Street, back in 2011, people are not really talking about climate change or about carbon. And this is similar in a number of these other urban interruptions. But my argument here is that objectively, you have not a tension between social justice and climate policy, but you have two rival forms of ecological politics. You have on the one hand, an explicit climate project targeted to the mostly professional class, and then you have an implicit project of low carbon urbanism coming out of housing movements and their allies. Objectively, what we think of as a democratic gray ecology, even when they're not talking about climate. Now, I hope you've agreed with that characterization, but interestingly enough, the people in housing movements also have access to the internet and to knowledge, and they can see what's going on. And in Sao Paulo, although Araujo, the woman I showed you earlier, never really gets into the idea this is about climate, others in her very same housing movement did. The elder statesman of her housing movement, Manuel del Rio, started arguing in 2011, wait a minute, if we're gonna have a low carbon city in Sao Paulo, it should be a low carbon city for working class people. They should get to live downtown near jobs and services. And Del Rio can see this because he has already been doing this kind of fusion of themes in his organizing for decades. He went from the labor movement to the housing movement because he saw gentrification in Sao Paulo and said, wait a minute, people are getting pushed further and further away from their jobs. That's lengthening the workday without increasing their wages. For Del Rio, gentrification is wage theft because it's simply a longer commute with no compensation in pay. So he's already arguing from the 80s that the wage struggle and housing struggle are the same fight. And so he's very well prepared, and his housing movement is very well prepared to start arguing in the early 2010s, actually, we need a right to the city, social housing oriented, and that there's every possible connection between the right to live in central spaces, near transit, near jobs, near services. That is going to be the most low carbon city. And it creates, ultimately, you're getting now from housing movements an alternative vision. Actually, I've got these slides switched here. That's a mistake. So ignore that slide. You have a kind of alternative vision emerging. So we skip ahead, and this vision starts to percolate into the political left in Sao Paulo. In 2012, Fernando Haddad, he's a PhD in philosophy, gets elected mayor of Sao Paulo with housing movement support on the promise that he will cancel Nova Luz. And that's the first thing he does when he gets into office. He cancels Nova Luz. He starts expropriating these abandoned buildings so that they can be turned into social housing. Under pressure from transit activists, the Haddad government builds hundreds of kilometers of bus lanes almost overnight, just with paint. And this leads immediate reductions in diesel, in carbon emissions, and in commute times along the new bus lanes. There's an immediate benefit there in terms of inequality and carbon. And that same government also puts together a master plan, not just to create a kind of green redevelopment bubble downtown, but instead to create axes of densification, transit-oriented development around the city. And under intense pressure from the housing movement, the mayor agrees to have in this plan affordable housing zoned all along these axes of densification. So you can have public transit, built up residential and commercial spaces, and public housing should be zoned all along these axes. Now, the government, Haddadi, the mayor, basically never talks about this in terms of climate change. But behind the scenes, the architects of this plan know very well that this is also a plan for environmental benefit in all kinds of different ways. And I've attended meetings where the main author of this plan, a city councillor called Nabil Bonduki, a historian of housing and a member of the Workers' Party, explained this very clearly. And indeed, what I learned was that Bonduki's office, which was kind of spearheading this plan in city council, had what they called a federation of issues, uma federação de pautas, where they had one key staffer talking to the environmental movement, one key staffer talking to the housing movement, one key staffer talking to the real estate industry. And then the office of Bonduki, they would get together and come up with policies, a kind of passive coalition that would generate, that would satisfy these multiple demands, in particular housing demands and environmental demands, and with some kind of development issues that could pass. And so one idea, by the way, of this densification is that developers are going to actually have to pay a fee to develop in these areas, and then that fee is going to be used to fund social housing. So Haddadi needs the housing movement to get this gray ecology passed. This picture is from him on a sound truck. He's a very awkward speaker, but it looks good in the picture, asking the housing movement to come out and put pressure on city council to pass the plan. And they do. The movement comes out and they burn tires in front of city council. City council passes the plan that night. It's also a scandal because it's such a violent protest. And the mayor says, oh, I never would have expected this to happen. But this is what environmental protest, I would argue, looks like in Sao Paulo. It's not green policy elites with pictures of trees. It's members of the housing movement putting pressure on city council to authorize public transit and social housing to be built together at the same time along different axes in the city. Now, ultimately, Haddadi is defeated. He's not able to get reelected. There are like a whole range of causes for this, including most prominently probably a right-wing sweep all across the country. But even so, many elements of this master plan survive. And indeed, funds for that come out of building more densely for real estate have already been used to pay for the expropriation and the purchase by the city of the building that Araújo occupied. So you're still getting, even from this only half implemented master plan, some of those benefits of social housing tied to densification, which is super interesting. And the last time I saw Araújo, she was actually very happy. And here she is in the kind of childcare space of her housing occupation. So, in brief, from Sao Paulo, what I'm arguing is that climate policy stagnation often comes from the estrangement of housing and green groups. That when luxury ecology regimes pursue forms of green urban policies, where the housing movements become afraid they're going to be displaced or pushed out, those movements are going to resist those green policies. They're going to attack them, and they're going to have the capacity very often to stop them or at least to slow them down. So that when you have luxury ecology policies that pit greens against housing groups, that tends to lead towards stagnation. By contrast, when you have policies that have co-benefits for both housing movement groups and for the environment, you're actually able to build a broader coalition that is more likely to be able to put pressure on the real estate industry successfully and to get policies passed that will reduce carbon emissions and that will also attack inequality. And the key point here is that I'm making an argument that it's about the substance of policy and about the political coalitions that organize around that policy. And I'm going to make an argument now that actually New York exemplifies this argument, and if anything makes that what we see in New York is that this is even more true in New York City. Now I'm going to go very, very quickly through this and happy to talk more about it later. But New York, you see, similar to Sao Paulo in the 2000s, you also see a failure of a major high-profile low-carbon density initiative, the downtown congestion pricing effort of the Bloomberg administration. Bloomberg tried to copy what London had done. Basically, you'd have to pay a fee to drive in central and lower Manhattan. And ultimately, he could not win support for this from the Democratic Party at the level of the state. And so this policy was never even voted on. It went nowhere. And I'm happy to talk more about this later, but the way that I investigated the politics of this is I looked at the environmental elites who tried to push this congestion policy, and I looked at the housing movement that was furious at Bloomberg at the same time that had a completely different read on the city. And no one has ever looked at these two questions together. What's remarkable is that Bloomberg, who was also giving out hundreds of millions of dollars in philanthropy at the same time as he was mayor, was able to build a massive coalition in support of congestion pricing, but not one of the 335 groups that supported congestion pricing was one of the city's major housing organizations. And because the housing groups refused to support congestion pricing, the Working Families Party also refused. to get into this fight and to support congestion pricing. So you had this seemingly win-win social policy effort where people would pay a price to go downtown, and then that cost would go, that revenue would go into public transit. But nobody really liked this policy. And again, I'm skating quickly here, but when I compared what happened in London to New York, I showed that actually in London, this is built up as a much more democratic from below policy, congestion pricing, than it is in New York. And so in London, when you compare public opinion, there was even and majority support in London. Basically every social income group in London supported congestion pricing, and it was relatively even across groups, a difference of only 9 percentage points in support from the lowest income to the highest income people in London. In New York, by contrast, the policy was always unpopular. Bloomberg never sold it. And working class people in New York absolutely hated congestion pricing. 29 points less support for congestion pricing in New York, from the lowest income New Yorkers to the highest income New Yorkers. So you have essentially New York City under Bloomberg, massive rejection from working class people of a policy that would tax people driving cars to pay for public transit. And I argue that this has everything to do with housing politics in the city and Bloomberg's failure to win support from working class constituencies, and in particular from the housing movement, to help sell this policy. Bloomberg also fails to pass significant legislation to reduce carbon emissions in buildings. He gets some things done, but he had a very big push to slash emissions in big buildings. The real estate industry was completely opposed, and city council refused to even vote on the bill. So a key area where Bloomberg is going to his own allies and saying, I would love for you guys to cut emissions in your building. They say no. He has no political leverage over them because it's his own base, and the policy drops. Overall, under the Bloomberg administration, by far the biggest source of emissions reductions is the replacement of coal with fracked gas in the power plants feeding the city. There's also, Bloomberg eliminates the most polluting heating oil. There are some successes under Bloomberg, but in terms of big systematic changes to the urban form, the big ticket items that Bloomberg himself was very excited about early in his tenure as mayor, those policies don't pass. And I'm going to argue that that has everything to do with Bloomberg's luxury ecology governing framework. Now, analogous to what you see in Sao Paulo, in response to Bloomberg, you get a center-left mayor who comes in on a housing-first platform, Bill de Blasio, who has now been a great disappointment to many. But even so, under de Blasio, you have a new political opening for de Blasio himself, but also for city council to explore strategies to decarbonize the city that will also win support from progressive movements. You get, coming out of the People's Climate March, the formation of a coalition around something called Climate Works for All, labor groups, progressive groups, housing groups, trying to come up with policies that will be good for housing and that will be good for the climate and will be good for workers. The Working Families Party starts to get really, really interested. And here again, carbon emissions accounting comes in I think a pretty interesting way. What I learned is that a sociologist called Joel Rogers was going around with the Working Families Party with this little energy diagram. And what this energy diagram shows is that if you look at the light gray flows here, over half the energy in the United States that is produced is ultimately wasted. They diplomatically call this rejected energy in this Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory diagrams. And what's happening is essentially fossil fuel combustion is so inefficient that you have massive energy waste. And now I'm going to show you a fake news, a simulated primary document based on anecdotes I've heard. So what Joel Rogers would do is he came around with these pieces of paper and he had drawn lines from the wasted energy and written jobs next to them. And so what Joel Rogers was saying to the folks in the Working Families Party was like, look, if we're going to decarbonize the city, we're going to have to get rid of all this wasted energy from fossil fuels. And all of that is going to be work that we can get for union members and for low income and working class people in New York City. So the Working Families Party becomes convinced from their way of seeing carbon emissions and the way carbon flows through the economy that this has become a working class issue for them. At the same time, the housing movement decides that they're going to take up climate change. This has something to do with Hurricane Sandy. It also has to do with the idea that they want to basically have a racial justice, climate justice, labor justice fusion. And one of the key leaders of this movement, New York Communities for Change, and their take on climate change is this woman, Rachel Rivera. She was literally born on the American Airlines flight from Puerto Rico to New York City. And she's a twin. So you can imagine any labor nightmare story you've had is probably not as bad as giving birth to two twins on a plane between Puerto Rico and New York. I mean, at least it's a short flight, but it's still a pretty hectic situation for having a child. Rachel Rivera, during the Bloomberg years, has never heard about climate change, doesn't care about it. She's too busy getting gentrified out of multiple different neighborhoods, out of Williamsburg, out of Bushwick. She ends up in Crown Heights. And on the night of Hurricane Sandy, she is in Crown Heights in a very poorly maintained apartment. And she wakes up to the sound of a crack in her roof. And she goes into her daughter's room, grabs her daughter out of her bed, and the next minute, the ceiling collapses onto her daughter's bed under the weight of all this rain pouring down. Rivera has to abandon the apartment right away. She told me that she lost everything that night and that she was evicted by Sandy. She ended up in the city's shelter system, which was terrible. She then ended up, as many sort of Sandy refugees internal to New York City, in a hotel in Midtown. And while she was there, she started doing research for her to help her daughter on a research project for school. And she learned about climate change. And she realized that Sandy had been exacerbated by the combustion of fossil fuels. The other thing that happened to her at that moment is that the city was trying to kick her out of this hotel room. The city was trying to get everybody out of the system. And New York Communities for Change, not literally this guy, his name is Patrick Houston, he's brilliant, but another guy called Pete Nagy from that movement came, found Rachel Rivera in the hotel and said, listen, we're gonna help you make sure you have housing at the end of this ordeal. And they helped arrange for her to get a kind of emergency housing voucher. So she was able to get another apartment finally back in East New York. And she became a very prominent leader in fights against gentrification in East New York and for climate policy that would also protect affordable housing. And her advocacy and her work with New York Communities for Change was ultimately central to New York City passing the country's most ambitious low carbon buildings bill in 2019. A bill that in many ways was very similar to what Bloomberg had proposed 10 years earlier, but this bill had special provisions to ensure that you would never have retrofits to affordable housing that would cause rents to go up in that rent-regulated affordable housing. So you have a coalition comes together of housing movements, the Working Families Party, green policy elites. They all come together and figure out a bill, and they managed to get the REBNY, the real estate board, to REBNY actually opposes this bill, but they still get City Council to vote. I think it was 45-2 in favor of this bill, a Green New Deal for New York City. So huge reversal. In 2009, Bloomberg couldn't even get a vote in City Council on dramatic reductions to buildings' carbon emissions. And in 2019, thanks to leadership from the housing movement and other progressives, the bill passes with a crushing majority, even when it's being opposed by real estate, the most powerful lobby in New York City. So here's Rachel Rivera and two of her daughters at City Council the day of the vote. I was there, and a really remarkable thing happened there. The city councilor who proposed this bill, Costa Constantinidis, city councilor from Queens, he said, we have to pass this bill so that when mothers go to sleep at night, they're not worried that their family will be displaced by rising seas or by rising rents. And to me, this is a line unimaginable that you would hear that in let's say, under the Bloomberg administration. Unimaginable to hear, without the housing movement playing such a big role. But what you find is that New York City, becoming a national leader on climate change, the city councilor makes like a 1.5-minute speech on its behalf on the floor of City Council. And the thing that he emphasizes, again, is the analogy between the existential threat of eviction and the existential threat of climate disaster. The big difference, the ultimate difference between 2009 and 2019 is that the housing movement is able to put so much pressure on City Council. They basically say to City Council Speaker Corey Johnson, we will end your career unless you make this bill happen. And it does. And so ultimately, although I started my research to see contrasts between Sao Paulo and New York, what I ultimately found were actually analogies. In many ways, when you look at the coalitional dynamics, the role of real estate, the difference between luxury and democratic ecologies, I found more analogies than differences in two very, very different cities. Again, one in New York City in the United States, Sao Paulo in Brazil, a country that has many, many differences. And again, to go back to our chart here, I think we can very easily understand what happened in New York as a difference between somewhat similar bills, right? Reduce carbon emissions in buildings, but there's a luxury ecology version that Bloomberg can't get voted on. There's a democratic ecology version with specific provisions to protect renters, fought for by the housing movement. That passes in New York. And by the way, they just managed to strengthen this bill about 6 weeks ago in City Council, or rather 5 weeks ago. And I think Cecil Scheib, who's on this call, knows a huge amount about this process, and it would be interesting to hear his take on this, I think. There was a certain amount of rambunctiousness in the negotiation between environmental and energy experts and the housing movement in cobbling together this 2019 bill. But again, climate policy stagnation resulting from estrangement of housing and green groups. And then on the other hand, democratic ecology regimes able to stitch those together. In Sao Paulo, the coalition was indirect. In New York City, the coalition becomes direct, very explicit, very straightforward. And in each case, in all these cases, everybody is thinking carefully about the way that carbon emissions filter down into their own everyday lives, into their own ongoing political struggles. Now, let me just say a word about this idea of following the carbon and how it can inform yet other kinds of work beyond this kind of like pretty straightforward kind of like political coalition formation at the level of cities. One thing I realized in the course of this research is that if people care so much about interpreting carbon emissions, then we should be people studying this should also be producing carbon emissions analyses. And maybe we can do it even better than it's often being done. So one thing that we did, I and some collaborators, we tested this hypothesis from David Owen. He's argued in the 2000s that the future of real sustainability will look a lot more like Midtown Manhattan than rural Vermont. It's this idea that through density, apartment buildings on bicycles, you'll have lower emissions, and it's intuitive. And Midtown Manhattan is very dense, so maybe it would be the lowest carbon part of Manhattan. Well, working with Kevin, we analyzed the carbon footprints per household, per zip code in all of New York City, and we made a map. And what do we find? The darkest shaded areas in this map of New York have the highest carbon footprints for the families that live in those neighborhoods. The highest carbon footprints in New York are found in Midtown Manhattan, in the West Village, and to some degree in the bougier parts of Brooklyn. And what you see instead is that there is a kind of crescent moon of very low carbon footprints that are found in working and middle class neighborhoods, often multiracial neighborhoods, neighborhoods that are being gentrified, neighborhoods that have a combination of density, public transit, very often anchored by public housing, but they don't have the extremely high levels of consumption of affluent New York. And to give you a clear sense of what is driving this inequality in emissions, it is really plane travel. There's a bit of an accounting quirk where our initial data combine public transit and planes. Public transit essentially has no emissions. So a huge amount of plane travel from Midtown Manhattan, and the extreme level of consumption of consumer goods in Manhattan. Multiple, we're talking things like iPads, Apple Watches, et cetera. There is a level of affluence where the consumption is so high that it blows out the carbon savings of density. And that's what we see in Manhattan. And so we actually shouldn't look to the richest parts of cities that are often driving exclusionary policies as the models of low carbon urbanism, we argue, but rather multiracial, multi-class, affordable housing anchored neighborhoods. And I think this mapping has had some impact on policy. We also realize that if you're following the carbon, you don't have to be limited to carbon. You can start to layer different kinds of data together once you get to the level of neighborhood level mapping, microspatial analysis. This is a very flexible tool in terms of data analysis and in terms of visual representation. So we can make these kind of like layer cakes. And on a less cute level, one of the things we're doing right now at Penn with my Sociospatial Climate Collaborative is we've constructed an eco-apartheid index. So this work hasn't been published yet. We'll be submitting it shortly. But we said, well, can we explain differences in racialized life expectancy by using a small number of variables that would add up to like a theory of eco-apartheid? Looking at South Africa, where apartheid is not, as talked about in the US, just a matter of segregation, but also labor markets, and it's also a matter of state violence. So we constructed an index that only has 6 elements in it that we consider an eco-apartheid index. Whether or not you count as a quote unquote essential worker. This is, we can code the labor market based on this COVID idea of essential workers, essentially working class. There are people eligible for Medicaid, but not even enrolled. This kind of captures the way that in the US, social policy is very exclusionary of the people who need the policies the most. What's your rent as a percentage of income? How housing insecure are you? How many police killings have there been in your neighborhood since 2017? You'll never hear police killing included as a form of environmental vulnerability, but we think that you cannot separate these forms of vulnerability and frankly, oppression. What is your heat vulnerability? Not in terms of the outdoor heat, but a combination of the heat island effect and the relative cost of air conditioning in your apartment, electricity. So we have an indoor heat island concept, which is again, a combination of outdoor temperature plus the burden of electricity cost as a share of your income. And finally, cold vulnerability. How exposed are you to cold in terms of the percentage of your income that goes to the gas bill? And that is, basically an index for heating in the winter. So we combine all these up to make a single index, and we say, how well does this compare differences in life expectancy in metro regions across the United States? It compares it pretty well, as I'll say in a minute, but I'll just say, we actually find a clear, these 6 factors give you a better association with lower life expectancy at the neighborhood level than the EPA's cancer risk tool, than redlining as a data source, or the CDC's social vulnerability index. So it performs extremely well, depressingly So we see life expectancy differences of 10 or more years strongly associated with this eco-apartheid index. And what you'll see here, the yellow bubbles represent the neighborhoods with the highest percentage of non-white residents. We didn't put race inside the index because then you could have a kind of circularity, but we see that the higher you are on the eco-apartheid index, the more likely your neighborhood is to have mostly non-white people, and the lower the life expectancy is. And we compared this as well with COVID deaths. And there too, we found a very strong association at the neighborhood level between the eco-apartheid index and the number of deaths from COVID so far. We looked at LA, at Chicago, and at New York City. The data from LA is a bit messy. New York City has the strongest association that we found between where you are on that eco-apartheid index and COVID deaths. Now, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a terrific abolitionist, Marxist, Black geographer at CUNY, defines racism as fundamentally about exposure, group differentiated exposure to premature death. And I think we're now trying to say, if we think about state violence and environmental inequality and social inequalities all together in place, we can really understand that exposure to premature death. And I'm hopeful that this will lead to more intersectional environmental thinking down the road. You can say a bit more about that later. Finally, if we're going to decarbonize these spaces in a just way, we have to leave the city. The carbon that we use in cities largely comes from energy and goods that come from elsewhere. When you think about decarbonizing the United States, you're thinking about massive transformations to landscapes. If you just think of it in terms of transmission, connecting wind and solar, here's the transmission we have now. Here's how much we're likely going to have to build in the next 10 or so years. Huge fights in the landscape are coming. I talk about this in terms of Gramsci. We can get into that later if people are interested. And in New York City, actually, what's been really interesting is that the movements that were so focused on New York City politics in the last 20 years start after People's Climate March really branching out to state level organizing. That's where the power is. If you really want to have an impact, you have to be involved at the state level. They've done that with housing. They're doing it with climate policy. Key leaders from New York's environmental justice and progressive community have branched out into the state, built coalitions, supporting clean energy construction elsewhere in New York State, founding a coalition called New York Renews, which got New York State to then pass the most ambitious climate target in the country. The very same people, basically, who got this buildings bill passed in New York City are also now operating at the state level. They've won a law that says 1/3 of all benefits of climate spending at minimum have to go to frontline communities. No one's sure exactly how that's going to happen, but the SC2 is working with NYSERDA, actually New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, to try to sort that out. So we're going to be essentially being consultants. And then I'll finally say quickly, just one last example, this idea of intersectional policy analysis, combining the qualitative and the quantitative research, is what we ended up doing to lead the research for the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act. I spent a lot of time talking to public housing residents in NYCHA at meetings, figuring out what those residents needed most, and then developing a model for decarbonizing New York's public housing and public housing around the country at the same time as we would meet all the various needs of residents for actually healthy, decent, sustainable, modern quality apartments. So thinking about carbon, thinking about living conditions, thinking about what residents themselves want, and packaging that together in a legislative package. I would not have had the resources to do that had I not done this longer term research on housing movements in Sao Paulo. So we generated the research supporting this bill, proudest moment of my life, possibly introducing the research on the bill with AOC at the Pelham Parkway houses, public housing complex in the Bronx. And so just to wrap up then very quickly, we live in a very dark time and people have been writing very depressing books about climate change. And often what they argue is that climate change is such a big problem, such an encompassing problem, such a complex problem, that there's really just no way for a human being or a group of human beings to wrap their head around it, that we're kind of trapped by the complexity of this problem. It's the wicked problem to kill all wicked problems. What I've tried to argue today is that following the carbon, as much as it might seem like a very socially thin endeavor, that it's the kind of thing that would distract us from the richness and complexity of the social world, that in fact, by following the carbon into the viscera of social life, we actually come to discover the complexity of the social world. We can actually develop more holistic, more encompassing ways of understanding political conflict and the possibilities for a safe and low carbon future by following the carbon viscerally and from a multitude of different perspectives. That following the carbon doesn't have to pull us away from rich social analysis, but instead it can reveal how all of these things are interconnected. It can help us see how colonialism and racial capitalism are the modalities through which climate change is lived. That when we start to see the world from that perspective, we can see how fights from everyday people to live decent lives in these very complex cities that we live in, those fights aren't something that have to be balanced with the struggle to decarbonize, but those fights are the engines of decarbonization that are ultimately going to get us to meet our climate goals. So thank you very much for bearing with me on this crazy presentation, and very much looking forward to discussion.
Great, thank you so much. And I guess we can open the floor to questions.
Is it okay if I dive in? Oh, are we doing in the chat? Sorry.
No, no worries.
No, I'm sorry. I just didn't want to turn my video on, but you skipped over kind of quickly the Gramsci part of your presentation, and you said you could come back to it, and I'm a theory nerd, so I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yes, absolutely. Let me just call out that slide. That's probably the best way, since I can't remember anything anymore, COVID plus age. There we go. You can see that now, hopefully. So Gramsci wrote this incredible book called The Southern Question a very long time ago. And it's a really interesting book. I think it's a book that everyone should read. So the basic situation right now is we need to build an enormous amount of clean energy, obviously. And clean energy is much less dense in terms of its footprint on the landscape as fossil fuel energy. Basically, you need to spread out a lot of solar panels. You need to spread out a lot of wind turbines. If you want to catch, from the sun and from the wind, enough energy to power an economy. And even more, because you essentially have to overbuild because you don't always know when the sun is going to shine or when the wind is going to blow. So you need to have kind of like overcapacity, which also involves things like storage. And so what's happening in the US right now is you're having cities are signing up on these declarations, 100% clean energy, de Blasio, Mayor Kenny in Philly, you name it. But what they're actually signing up to is a piece of paper that says somewhere outside of the city, they're going to build a ton of new infrastructure. And you have a lot of opposition to that new infrastructure in rural spaces. And that opposition is super complex. You have all kinds of things going on. You have, in a lot of cases, sort of like wealthy suburbanites or suburbanites who have moved into the countryside because they want to experience true nature. They have a kind of Arcadian concept of nature. And they are very opposed to clean energy development. You have people like the Koch brothers, now there's just one Koch brother, main one, but who are putting money into anti-wind advocacy, right? So it's become a conservative cause. You hear Donald Trump saying, wind turbines are gonna cause cancer or something. But you also have examples where people are resisting turbines and solar energy development because those are basically corporate projects that come and land with the side and communities, are done very quickly and don't take into account local planning. You get sometimes complicated economic issues. So for instance, sometimes what you're seeing in upstate New York is that people who own farmland are realizing they can make more money by shifting some of that land from food production over to solar panel, building solar parks. And those landowners then, they're like, this is awesome, but I'm gonna kick out some of these tenant farmers. Now, tenant farmers are not wealthy people. These are people who are really struggling to get by. They're renting out land to farm on it. And those tenant farmers are then saying, oh my God, you're now kicking me off my land from making food and replacing me with solar energy because you can get more tax revenue, more sales revenue. More tax revenue for the city, more sales revenue for the landowner. And so what you have is this sort of like pretty complicated process. And I think what you're seeing is kind of congealing in many rural places, not all by any means, but in many, a kind of idea that rural landscapes are being kind of devastated and industrialized and transformed for the sole benefit of city residents. And you have city residents, like you will never see Bill de Blasio upstate, having a conversation with a farmer talking about why it's important for there to be solar power feeding into New York. So what Gramsci is after in the Southern Question is he's trying to understand why is it that in low-income parts of Southern Italy, you have a lot of political support for the political right. And how the way that that's often is done is because wealthy elites in rural places in Southern Italy are essentially mobilizing this kind of anti-urban bias, saying, oh, these communists in Turin, they're a bunch of urban elites, screw them, they don't represent your real interest, listen to the priest, and that kind of thing. So what we're trying to do with this idea of kind of Gramscian landscapes is take that rich class analysis that also takes culture very seriously and try to use that to understand what is going on with rural and urban attitudes and tensions around wind wind and solar construction and transmission, power lines. So thinking about this ostensible city-country opposition as really being about a number of multiple contradictory class interests. And I think this applies to all US politics right now that are really characterized by this urban-rural split in electoral behavior. Think about the congealed prejudices in each camp, not say that either side is like right about the other, but try to understand how has this tension come about? Why is each side thinking about the other in this way? Is it possible, and under what conditions could the urban left, social movements, racial justice movements make common cause with working and lower income folks in rural areas? I'm thinking about designers as potentially playing a big role. We know that in Northern Europe, some of the really successful clean energy construction in rural spaces is led by very sensitive design processes. And then finally, just as on the theme of my overall talk, really understanding the environment and economic development as basically the same thing and not as kind of separate issues, which is maybe not 100% what Gramsci was getting at, but I think pretty consistent with his framework. So sorry, this is kind of like long-winded, but it's a very long way to say that there's a rich tradition in Marxism, but not only Marxism, of trying to understand the politics of very entrenched regional differences in terms of political views. And that, I think, is a really helpful tradition to mobilize if we want to understand the emergence of urban-rural tensions around the clean energy economy now.
Great, thank you so much. The only reason I was asking, and then I'm done after this, was just because I was thinking about Stuart Hall was in conversation with Gramsci talking about race and kind of building upon his theory. So the whole time I was listening to your presentation, my only sort of knowledge around this topic is tethered to like conversations on environmental racism. So that was kind of my entry point for attempting to orient myself in your amazing presentation. So I just wanted to hear how you worked with his work and then kind of branching off in my own research for thinking about Hall and other ones. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. I mean, I'm sure you noticed this line here. I felt rushed for time, but what I would normally say is just as Stuart Hall argues that race is the modality through which class is lived, I think I want to argue that colonialism and racial capitalism are the modalities through which climate change is lived. But the work on New York and Sao Paulo doesn't have as much explicit racial theory as maybe it should. I'm not sure. The problem is that there have been decades of really bad comparative analysis of race in Brazil and the US, and it's really, really complex to think about racial regimes specifically in those places. And so it seemed it would have been a trap, I think, in this book, which has so many other moving parts, to really dive in to that literature. And so the solution I've come up with is just my entire next project will be on race in the built environment, much more explicitly. And I think, I'm not sure if you've read the Omi and Winant work on racial formation, but I'm really interested in thinking about racial projects and infrastructural projects as going together. So we get a sense of that in US urban history, suburbanization, redlining, and so on. But I think we want to start thinking about things like energy infrastructure as well. Like right now, in places like Queens, communities of color are saying you have to get these natural gas peaker plants out of our neighborhoods. We should call them methane gas peaker plants. But in order to actually successfully do that, you're going to have to build a bunch of clean energy outside of New York City. And so this is going to be very hard to do unless you ultimately have a coalition for basically like racial liberation and decarbonization that crosses urban-rural lines. And so I think that that's kind of where I'm headed, and it's going to involve more Stuart Hall, of course, policing. Without any question.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Thanks.
I believe we had another person who wanted to ask a question. Or we can open up the floor again. If you have a question, please feel free to unmute and ask away.
I could ask a question. Hi, Daniel. Really great, amazing presentation. Really excited to see the work on eco-apartheid. Kind of not to go back to the question of green policy elites, but I was really struck by really how flexible they are, right? They seem to be able to draw coalitions with kind of neoliberal right-wing politicians that want to redevelop urban spaces for capital. They're also happy to chat with movements, both in New York and in Sao Paulo. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about, why is it that, the climate first actors are able to be this flexible? Do they not have any political commitments in the first place? Are they just simply interested in reducing carbon, no matter how that looks like? And the second thing is, is it worth kind of thinking through the different types of green policy elites that might exist, right? So are there, it seems to be that a lot of the focus is on heads of departments or like the lobbyist types that are in halls of power, but there are also kind of a lot of street level bureaucrats that might be much more engaged with the movements and on the ground, the residents of these different housing movements, et cetera. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about that process.
Thanks so much. That's a really great question, and I'm really glad that that portrait of the contradictory quality of green policy elites came through, because it's exactly to your point. I think it's a messy category, not because the category is messy, because the social reality is messy. I have generated multiple different classificatory schemes for the green policy elites, but one worries about having too many of these. But I think broadly speaking, right, the sort of basically obvious breakdown is you have essentially true believers on each side. You have really committed neoliberal green policy elites. You have really committed leftist green policy elites. And you have probably the biggest number who are people who are really environmentally committed green policy elites. And I think that broad sector, and I think this is true across the social, let's say, like hierarchy, let's say, whether it's, people at the highest levels of government or street level, the largest number are just sincerely committed to climate goals. And I think for that reason, understandably, we're going to want to work with whoever's in power. I mean, I don't think that's really that hard to explain. Like this person I was talking about, Alejandra De Vecchi, who got locked into brutal fights with the housing movement. Her dissertation was on how to improve low-income housing in downtown Sao Paulo. So she actually didn't come up. She ended up in environmental policy world because of some networking through the Rockefeller Foundation, actually. But she came into this really as a committed housing person, and through a series of contingent factors became totally alienated from the housing movement. She'll never be able to go back. She's going to work in environmental consulting for the rest of her life, because when you have a 3-year pitch battle like that, it can be hard to bounce back. But so, yeah, again, I think what you're definitely seeing in the US now, and you've certainly seen in New York, though, I think, is you have probably more people shifting over. I didn't show this quote from Maloufi here. Let me show it. The same Maloufi who says this, for example, it's fundamentally about the creative policy elites. By the end of the time in Sao Paulo, his views have really shifted. I'm not totally sure where he is now. He now works on sustainable electric buses in Brazil. But he says, actually, I came to realize that the left has a strong social agenda, social development, reduction of inequality. And by coincidence, the politics that achieve this are very good for the climate. I focus on policy impact now, he's saying, but not the discourse of climate change. He doesn't totally acknowledge how much his views have shifted, but I have the receipts. And what he's basically saying is, and it's true, it is basically a coincidence that that public transit is better for working class people and for the climate. I mean, I'm not, at some level, of course, social equality is probably more environmentally sustainable, but it's hard to say. But in cities, it is certainly true that more social housing, more public transit, less extremes of wealth, less private car development is just better for the environment. And what Maloufi realizes, so by the end of his time working with the C40, he told me he's constantly on the phone with headquarters in New York and saying, like, STFU about carbon, we have to engage the social reality of a country like Brazil if we want to make any kinds of progress. And so, yeah, one could come up with a scheme. I think historically, again, in New York, you see just a shift as the politics have changed. The environmental movement is much more sophisticated. You also see, and I think this also is important, is that the social movements are more and more willing to talk to environmentalists and to help co-produce more democratic environmental regimes. I mean, I think it is probably true that the housing movement in the 2000s in New York, they're getting slaughtered by Bloomberg. So it's understandable that they didn't come to the table on Plan YC, on the environment. But I think it is helpful that now members of the housing movement themselves are doing like climate study groups, and they're now able to come to the table. So long story short, yes, the green policy elite is like a malleable category. There's a lot of different things going on. The classificatory scheme could be helpful, but it's, book by book or paper by paper, there's just a question of how many categories you want to introduce. So that's more of a rhetorical issue than a conceptual one. And it could actually be useful to write an entire paper on urban green policy elites. I mean, I think that would be a fascinating paper to read. I don't know if I would be the one to write it, but maybe we should write it together. And if you look at the global, I mean, it's super interesting. Obviously, you do a lot of work in, in India, and you get all different kinds of specificities, different traditions, whether the green policy elites come out of global policy networking or whether they come out of, let's say, like in Brazil, really the Green Party in Brazil is the landless peasants movement. And so all the things I'm talking about in Sao Paulo have nothing to do with the countryside, where the left and the environment are the same cause, basically 100%. So you get these different like micro political cultures.
Great, thank you. We do have a question in the chat from Jeremy. Jeremy asks, what role does philanthropy have or can have in this type of work? Jeremy says, I'm thinking of the positive case, as Leah Stokes has argued, and also potentially the negative case that philanthropy could steer movements and others towards certain policy areas at the expense of others.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, philanthropy is also a big group, right? And so it's a really good question, and we have to sort of break things down. I mean, you look at Jeff Bezos is giving $1 billion to climate causes, almost exclusively to elitist white middle-class NGOs with, I would argue, pretty mixed and unenviable record. Not exclusively, some money to the Indian Collective, but not great. At the same time, you know, it plays a role. And again, as always, it's like, let's expand our category even of the green nonprofit, green philanthropy world. The housing movement I've been talking about in Sao Paulo is called Frente de Luta pela Moradia, Front for Struggle for Housing. And then they have a kind of NGO counterpart, like a C3, I guess, called Apoio, which means support. And that has gotten a lot of funding, you know, goes a long way in the Sao Paulo housing movement, from CAFOG, which is Catholic aid charity in England. They actually call it CAFOD, but in Portuguese they call it CAFOG. And so that's money from the church. And they sort of said, well, you know what, as time's passed, you know, we need to be funding in Brazil. We want to kind of see some environmental programming. So my understanding of the chronology is that the housing leadership of the movement starts arguing in 2010, 2011, low carbon urbanism has to be working class urbanism. And from that conversation, they have an ongoing relationship with CAFOD, and CAFOD says, you know what if we put in some funding to sustainable housing, kind of like almost like policy development within the movement, and that kind of starts to take off. So it does play an important role in that movement. Now, at the same time, you can look at other housing movements in Brazil that have also now taken up the climate cause, and they don't have philanthropic funding. So I don't think you would say it's like fundamentally necessary. And then I think the other thing, so, you know, it goes different ways. I think on the whole, the fundamental problem with philanthropic funding is that if you're dependent on philanthropies for funding, then your priorities are going to be driven by philanthropists, not by your movement base. But yes, it is possible for philanthropy to play a good role, and it sometimes has. In New York, what happened with New York Communities for Change, how they really got involved in climate, is that one of the key organizers of the kind of leader of their climate program, someone called Pete Sikora, he'd been working at CWA, Communication Workers of America. He read Bill McKibben's article, Climate Change is Terrifying New Math. It just shattered his brain, and he's like, I need to get into the climate space. I just have to do it full time. And the pitch he came up with for New York Communities for Change was, listen, the only way you get things done in New York City is with a coalition of middle-class progressive whites. Basically progressive, it's not even middle classes too, small German New York, progressive whites and communities of color. And what we can do with climate is we can raise a lot of money from progressive whites, whether that's, you know, individual donations or philanthropy. We can raise some money from them, but we're going to power this organizing with working class people of color. They're going to like be leading the charge, but we're going to get some extra funding from the progressive whites because it's linked to climate. And so it's a strategic kind of coalition that can actually, you know, get things done, will be good for the movement, et cetera. And, you know, I'd say so far that's pretty much worked out. And so that again would be a case where it's like the insight there is to realize, not think of this as a climate issue, but almost like combining climate with a broader social justice agenda, looking at the structure of funding that's available in New York City, and putting these different pieces together. So I don't think, you know, it's not like that looks very different from, let's say, what the World Resources Institute, how they see the world and the kinds of coalitions that they're building. So once again, yes, there's a role for private funding, but again, it looks pretty different from the traditions of green philanthropy that we've seen so far. I can't really say enough about NYCC's work on the climate space. I mean, it's really extraordinary. They now have a team of 3 different climate organizers. They've also helped to win this fight around divestment. They're helping to win fights to block pipelines. And, you know, this used to be a group called Acorn. They did nothing on climate a decade ago. And they're huge leaders now. And it's only possible, and multiple of the organizers put it to me, it's only possible because they've done so much to help their base on housing, immigration, and labor issues, that when they say, let's talk about climate, their base is like, okay, I'm interested. And then they have leaders like Rachel Rivera, who are just like brilliant women who are able to see the world in profoundly new ways. I can talk more about that if people are interested.
Great, thank you. So at 1:15, we will be closing the public portion of this research seminar. So I'll give one last opportunity for a quick question if anyone has it.
I could ask a question. So thank you so much for your presentation. It was super interesting. I have a question regarding the index you mentioned. I think it's a very comprehensive measure, the eco-apartheid index. And I was wondering if there were any other markers or items included regarding other environmental injustice variables impacting health. For instance, I was thinking about environmental or chemical exposures like lead exposures or water contamination like through lead or PFAS, or air pollution, like PM 2.5, which have been also related to life expectancy, particularly PM 2.5. So I was wondering if that was the case for this index, for this measure, because in lower SES communities, they are more prone to be exposed to these chemicals, unfortunately.
Absolutely, thank you. That's a brilliant question. And by the way, Aldana,
Yeah, I know we have the same second last name. Thank you, yeah, for noticing.
Oh my God, I don't see it often.
Yeah, same.
Anyways, another time we could talk. In my case, it's from Guatemala. So the issue is in part, so the answer is obvious, like, yes, environmental contamination causes harm. Okay, we know that. So now let's get into like some kind of quibbles if we have a minute here. California has a tool called the Cal Enviro Screen, which represents where we are headed right now. The idea that if we want to understand environmental inequality, we should, and this basically comes out of the legacy of the environmental justice movement, we should look at the coincidence of social vulnerability, social economic factors, and accumulated toxic harm. So California screens its investments, they say, but close to a third of investment from cap and trade revenues have to go into frontline communities. Well, it's actually 35%, but most of that has to go into frontline communities as determined by this Enviro screen. So here's the problem. The problem is that, especially when you look nationally, the data quality isn't good. If you go to the EPA website and you look at their EJ screen data, you have to be a little bit careful because often they combine social vulnerability with toxic exposure, and then what you essentially just get a map is of income, essentially. But if you just look at the toxic, so let's say if you just look at PM 2.5, you'll see that every time there's a jurisdiction, there's a wide variation in the exposure of 2.5. I'm sorry, chemicals cross jurisdictional borders. So what you have, the EPA is doing is they're aggregating data that's collected by different groups under different jurisdictions. And that means that it's not really comparable nationally. The other thing is that if you look at, let's say, New York City, PM 2.5, you don't really get a ton of neighborhood variation at the block level. Again, because these things are air contaminants and they kind of cross space. So we were like interested. We just sort of tested. We took what we thought was the best high resolution data on pollution. So we took the cancer risk measure from the EPA and we compared that to the eco-apartheid index, which has no environmental toxin exposure. And our EPA index, our eco-apartheid index still predicted life expectancy better than the cancer risk measure. Now, I think what we're looking into is doing eco-apartheid plus, where we would maybe include that cancer risk to capture toxic contaminant. I'd also add, like, you mentioned PFAs, that's really important when we're thinking about the Gramscian thing. You have really severe contamination in rural areas that has really negative health effects, especially for men. It shrinks genitals, it leads to testicular cancer. A lot of PFAs, these are like forever chemicals, come from things like military bases, because they would basically spray fire extinguishers onto runways that were full of PFAs as a way to like practice fire drills. So they're just massively contaminating the landscape just for no reason whatsoever. And this is, it's being litigated, but I think it would be politically really advantageous to be able to link the urban health issues in environmental justice communities, urban communities of color, and rural, often very low income white communities in rural spaces and say, listen, like you're facing basically the same thing. The EPA, I'm pretty sure they don't have PFA national data yet, but I'm looking into trying to track something down, at least for a region. So yeah, it's a really brilliant question. Fundamentally, the last point, which is obvious, right, is that social and environmental vulnerability are correlated, right? I mean, the reason you have toxic facilities largely in communities of color, because that's where it's easier to locate them. So I think with these indices, we don't want to get into too facile a causal argument. It's not necessarily that being an essential worker causes your life to be shorter. It's associated with it. But I think it's telling that with like robust neighborhood level data through the census, we can get a very, very strong association with lower life expectancy. And it's a way of getting at environmental inequality and kind of circumventing the data problems with the national data sets on toxic exposure.
Thank you. That was super informative. I couldn't agree more. Thank you.
Great, thanks. But yeah, we've got to keep this going. And if you're doing that kind of mapping, we should talk at some point for sure.
Yes, definitely.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So that concludes the public portion of this seminar.